And welcome back. We are today talking about the New Testament as history. And that title may be um, not particularly adequate, but it's the one we're going to work with. We've already talked about how the New Testament is Christian scripture, and that the New Testament is a book or a library of writings in book form. But it's more than that. It comes from a historical time and location. It is a historical record of some of the events in that time and location. Christianity is rooted in real history, and the New Testament doesn't ignore this. There are writings of the time that are just sayings and things like that. I'm thinking of the Gospel of Thomas, where it's completely stripped of history, and thus isn't generally used in Christian teaching because Christianity is a history-based faith. And so reading the New Testament without understanding its historical setting leads to shallow and possibly misreading understandings of its text. But it's not just history. There has been and still is a school of thought that tries to treat the New Testament as simple historical documents that we have to decipher the historical background and setting and the readers and the author and the various um, traditions that come together to make up this document and things like that. This is a historical critical method of reading, and it seeks to discover the historical setting of the texts, and not just the meaning of the text, but the historical setting of the text, and that is where the meaning stops. Now, I think that the historical critical method provides us with lots of very useful tools for interpreting scripture. But the historical critical scholar stops too quickly, sees the books as far too two-dimensional than they really are. Trying to find the sources and trace the history of the text, moving from oral to written, is always speculative and is never conclusive. Um, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do some of that and study some of that. Uh, dis It doesn't, however, address the purpose of the New Testament. Just knowing the beliefs of the time, the religious practices of the time, the social currents of the time, doesn't take us far enough. It's an outside reading, and we are inside people. One of the things we're going to be doing in this reading the New Testament with fresh eyes is move into the text. The world of the world that produced the New Testament is important. It's the world behind the text. It is important, but it's less important than the world the New Testament produces. And that second world is the one we should really work to enter. Humans don't live within historical events as much as the cultures that surround them. We have lots of quote unquote historical things going on in our own nation and the world as a global whole is as well. But those don't shape us nearly as much as the culture we live in. The specific king, revolutionary movement, natural disaster aren't as influential in shaping people's lives as the culture they live in. Historical facts aren't enough to understand the world of the New Testament. And I want to be very, very clear. I'm not saying we don't need the historical facts, that we shouldn't study the historical facts. We must. We are a religion based in history and we must study those, but we must not stop there. Culture is something else we should look at. And a culture is a symbolic world that we live in, and it operates both consciously and subconsciously in our lives. We are conscious of some parts of our culture and unconscious at with others. We just don't see them because we live in them, much as a fish doesn't necessarily see the water because they live in the water. These symbolic elements provide a framework for how people understand their lives individually and collectively. And because they're both conscious and subconscious, many of the things that we do are shaped by things we're not even conscious that they're shaping us. Now, some, but not all of the symbolic elements of a culture are uh, shared things like values, habits, and beliefs. These are things that are commonly held and maybe even not even thought about. This is why you can go from Kansas to my wife's home state of Florida, and oftentimes you're struck by the values or the habits that are just unconsciously taken people live in. When I first went to Florida with my wife, um, before we were married, in fact, it was the week we were getting married, we went out to a restaurant and I ordered iced tea. And they brought me the iced tea, and I took a drink and spit it out. It was disgusting. It was like syrup. You should never put sugar in tea, in my mind. And it just was inconceivable to me. And they said, well, it's not iced tea if it's not sugary. It's a different habit or a different value or a different belief, however you want to look at it. They put sugar in when they did it, and I don't, and I assumed they didn't, and they assumed that's what I wanted. That's part of a symbolic world. That's something that's just back there that everyone or many people operate out of. Um, and so, to understand the New Testament, we need to have some knowledge of the cultural or the symbolic world from which it emerged. And of course, knowledge of the history of the world helps us understand the culture of the specific time and place. So there's no advocacy here for a non-historical reading of a historical book, as I've said multiple times already today. We're advocating, though, a more profound reading than merely a historical one. Christianity came from Judaism, and the church has understood itself as the end goal of what God did through Judaism. It's not entirely different. There's significant continuity along with discontinuity from Judaism to Christianity. Jesus and all the writers of the New Testament understood Scripture to be what we know of as the Old Testament. It was the Bible of Judaism. It was only over the church's first century that people began to understand that the writings of the New Testament were also scripture. Certainly, it was before the New Testament was entirely written that they were doing that, because within the New Testament, Peter refers to writings of Paul and other scriptures. But it was a process of understanding that, and at first, it was just the Old Testament that was their scripture, which comes out of Judaism. And Judaism is a book-centered religion, just as Christianity is. So the symbolic world of Judaism provides important cultural clues about how to read the New Testament. The belief system of Judaism, one God. God chose to work through Israel to bring salvation. God reveals how we should live. God gives hope for the future, and more of those kinds of beliefs. Those all were largely taken over to the New Testament. Judaism always understood the world as essentially two groups of people. Jews and non-Jews. Now, of course, there were subgroups of Jews and non-Jews. There were the righteous non-Jews who had not converted but followed most of the law. There were Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and other and Zealots and other groups of Jews. But the large division was based on their understanding of God, choosing to work through them for the world's salvation. Judaism also saw itself as being under invasion by the surrounding cultures. And while most Jews accepted that vision, uh, different Jewish subgroups had a range of responses to that invasion. Now, these and other symbolic parts of the Jewish world underlie Christianity. Many unfortunate readings of the New Testament can be traced to theologians who didn't understand the Jewish symbolic world of first century AD. For example, Jesus's attacks in John on the Jews, uh, that was an internal subgroup kind of discussion. He wasn't attacking the Jews per se, but he was attacking the religious leadership and not even necessarily all of the religious leadership of Judaism. And so it was an internal kind of discussion and division. And so for people to not understand that, then they've used that for all kinds of anti-Semitic activities. The broader backdrop of the world that Christianity emerged from was the Greco-Roman symbolic world. There was no escaping the culture of the Romans. They held military control of the entire Mediterranean. And their culture was not a pure Roman symbolic world. It was a combination of their ancient symbolic world and the earlier Greek symbolic world. Greece had basically built the empire that Rome then controlled. And so Rome absorbed much of the uh, Greek symbolic world into its own, and we refer to this as the Greco-Roman culture. And the same symbolic elements are active in Greco-Roman culture that we saw in Jewish culture. They had a certain set of literature, belief systems, the understandings of people and values. And some symbols were shared between the two cultures, the Greco-Roman and the Jewish world. But others were widely divergent. Judaism's strict monotheism, for example, was in stark contrast to Greco-Roman polytheism, to the point that some people in the Greco-Roman world thought of Jews and then Christians as atheists because they didn't really believe in the gods. They only claimed to believe in one God. Um, and Greco-Roman polytheism was usually open to just adding new gods to its panoply of deities when they conquered a new group. The text delineates some Greco-Roman cultural differences from Judaism that are important to understanding the New Testament, and I would invite you to look at those closely, especially honor and shame and the patron-client relationships. Uh, they are possibly the most important for understanding parts of the New Testament in the fullest way possible. So take the time to understand them. Now, Christ followers come out of the Jewish symbolic world and they spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. And so they were rooted in both Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds. And over time, a new symbolic Christian world emerged, one that had continuities with and discontinuities from both of the earlier worlds. Literature was still important to Christians. They even drove the shift from scroll to codex, books rolled on long poles to books bound like modern books. Christian theology is primarily a story that flows from but extends beyond the Jewish story. Christians were strict monotheists, just like Jews, but Christians understood that the one God had some innate plurality. They would even point back to the very first words of Genesis to say, see, there is some plurality in God from the beginning. And then the Christians spent centuries trying to describe how does that plurality work? Coming up eventually with a Trinitarian formulation. Um, and Christianity believed in resurrection along with most Jews, but Christians believe that Jesus was resurrected in the middle of history, which most Jews rejected. And they also believed in many of the consequences of Jesus's resurrection for how we should live, which caused some discontinuities with Judaism. It shouldn't surprise us that Christianity shared symbolic elements of Judaism and the Greco-Roman cultures. And some have mistakenly interpreted the New Testament by ignoring one or the other of these two worlds, the one God of Judaism and the honor-shame dynamics of Greco-Roman culture, for example. Uh, Christianity merged these earlier symbolic elements of culture with new ones, and it causes a new and rich symbolic world that is distinctly Christian. In fact, Christians can live in any world, but they will never be entirely a part of any world, which is one of the things that is very disturbing when we see Christians trying to fit entirely in with the surrounding culture or trying to control the surrounding culture, because that moves us out of the Christian symbolic world when we do that, and it's no longer Christian. That's why things like Christian nationalism or Christian pluralism can't truly be Christian because they move out of the symbolic world of the New Testament. So we have all three of these overlapping worlds, and they're essential for understanding the teachings of the New Testament and applying them to our lives. When you write an exegesis is just an organized way of interpreting something, a text. So when you write that exegesis of your chosen passage, I'm going to ask you to enter the world of the New Testament, essentially the Christian symbolic world. Then after that, I'll ask you to enter the world behind the text, which is essentially the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds. And that may shift your understanding of the world of the New Testament somewhat. And so you will go back and forth between those two worlds. But knowing that you started with the most important, the world of the New Testament, and then you're augmenting that with what it sprang from. Finally, I'm going to ask you to stand in front of a fourth symbolic world that I haven't talked about yet. And that is our symbolic world in Western 21st century culture. Uh, and it's through the interplay of these symbolic worlds that you can gain a richer understanding of the message of the New Testament and how it might apply to your life and the lives of those to whom you minister. Uh, so I invite you to finish your reading and to get over to the message board and post some thoughts along these lines.